close your eyes for a moment. Not all the way, just enough to let the edges of the room soften. Let the light blur a little, the way it does when you are lying in bed and the day is finally done. You can hear the quiet hum of the world outside your window, the occasional car passing, the night settling in. Now, imagine that sound instead fading away into something far older, far deeper. Imagine the sound of stone. Thick, cold, unyielding stone, stacked high and held together by mortar and time. Imagine that there are no windows, or only a slit so narrow that the sky is just a thin gray thread far above your head. And the air is damp, the kind of damp that seeps into your clothes, your hair, your bones, no matter how many blankets you pile on. This is the world of the medieval prisoner, and tonight we are going to talk about how they slept. But before we step inside those dark towers and damp dungeons, let us take a breath. Let us slow down, because this is not a story of chase or escape. It is a story of stillness, of waiting, of the long nights that stretched for months and years. And perhaps in that stillness, there is a strange kind of peace to be found, even for us, listening from our safe and soft beds. The medieval prison was not a single thing. It was a collection of spaces, each with its own character, its own flavor of cold and confinement. There was the tower keep, high and drafty, where the wind played through the arrow slits like someone whistling a forgotten tune. There was the dungeon, carved into the bedrock beneath the castle, where the earth itself pressed in, heavy and silent. And there were stone cells, sometimes small and cramped, sometimes surprisingly spacious, but always, always built of that same enduring material that never quite warmed to the touch. Think of the tower. A tower is a vertical thing, reaching up toward the sky, but for the prisoner, it was a place of falling. Not physically necessarily, but in spirit. You climbed the spiral stairs, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and you were led into a round room, maybe 30 feet across, with a high vaulted ceiling. The walls were thick, sometimes 10 feet or more, pierced by arrow loops that let in a sliver of light during the day, and a river of cold air at night. The floor was stone, laid in uneven flagstones that had been polished by time. In the center of the room, or along one wall, there would be a ledge, a stone bench that served as a bed. And on that ledge, the prisoner would lay down a straw pallet, if they were lucky. Straw was the great comfort of the medieval world, the padding of the poor, the bedding of every peasant and every monk. But in a tower, the straw often came infested with fleas, and it grew damp quickly, as the moisture from your breath and your skin soaked into the stalks. After a few nights, it began to smell, a sweet and musty smell that clung to your clothes and your hair. But it was better than the bare stone, which drew the heat from your body as greedily as winter draws the color from a leaf. The sleeping arrangements in a medieval prison were not designed for comfort. They were designed for containment. But there is an odd irony in the history of imprisonment. Sometimes the conditions were not as horrifying as we imagine. In many cases, prisoners were expected to provide for themselves. They could buy better bedding. They could pay for extra food, They could even bribe the guards to let them bring in a proper mattress or a thick woolen blanket. The wealthy prisoner, the nobleman who had fallen from favor, might have a bed in his tower cell. Not a bed like ours, with springs and a frame, but a wooden platform raised off the stone, with a straw mattress and a feather pillow, and heavy curtains to keep out the drafts. He might have a brazier for heat, though the guards would carefully control how much fuel he could have, for fear that he might use it to signal or to burn his way out. But the ordinary prisoner, the peasant or the debtor or the common thief, slept on the floor, or on a pile of straw that was changed only when it became too foul to even stand upon. And then there was the matter of chains. Many prisoners were kept in fetters, iron bands around their ankles or wrists, connected by a short chain that made movement slow and clumsy. Imagine trying to sleep with a heavy iron ring around your leg, the metal cold against your skin, the chain clinking every time you shifted your weight. Some prisoners were fastened to the wall, with a chain so short that they could only lie in one cramped position, curled up like an animal in a den. Others were left in relative freedom within the room, but the sound of the chains, the constant rattle and clank, was a noise that never stopped. It became the background music of the night, a rhythm that you learned to sleep to, or that kept you awake in a state of half-alertness, always waiting for something. Dungeons, the true underground cells, were a different world. Here, there was no sky, no window, no slit of light. The only darkness was absolute, the kind that presses against your eyes until you see things that are not there, phantoms made of nothing but your own mind. The cold was deeper, too, because the earth kept a steady temperature just above freezing, and the stone walls wept with condensation. Water sometimes seeped through the floor, puddling in the low spots, and the straw would rot in a matter of days. A prisoner in an underground dungeon might have to sleep sitting up, leaning against the wall, because the floor was too wet to lie down upon. Or they might try to find a dry corner, a spot where the stone had been worn smooth by countless other bodies, and huddle there, shivering through the long hours until the guard changed and a meager meal was passed through the grate. And yet people slept. They slept because the body demands it, because even in the worst of conditions, exhaustion overcomes misery. They slept in fits and starts, waking in the dark to the sound of dripping water or the distant scratching of rats. They learned to fall asleep quickly, because sleep was an escape, a temporary freedom from the weight of stone and the ache of iron. And they dreamed. What did a medieval prisoner dream? Probably of open fields, of the sun on their face, of the smell of baking bread from a kitchen they would never enter again. But sometimes, on a cold night, when the wind howled through the arrow loops or the earth groaned above their heads, they might have dreamed of less pleasant things. The walls of a medieval prison were not simply walls. They were a presence, a personality, a witness to generations of suffering. And that presence seeped into the stone, into the air, into the very dust that settled on a sleeping prisoner's face. Let us consider the tower of the Château de Vincennes outside Paris. It is a beautiful place, a grand fortress with a tall keep that dominates the landscape. But in the 14th century, that keep held prisoners. They were kept in the upper rooms, which were actually among the more airy and spacious of medieval cells. The walls were covered in tapestries, at least for wealthier prisoners, and there were fireplaces that could be lit on special occasions. But the beds were still stone ledges. The prisoners still had to sleep on a narrow stone shelf with a rolled-up cloak for a pillow. They could pace the room during the day, but at night they had to lie down on that unyielding surface and try to find some comfort. Some prisoners requested that their guards allow them to sleep on the floor, which was also stone, but wider, so they could at least stretch their legs. The guards often refused because the floor was considered too vulnerable to the damp. Now, consider the opposite extreme: the underground prisons of the Tower of London, the crypts and vaults that held prisoners like Sir Thomas More and the young princes, the two boys who were never seen again. Those cells were small, windowless, and often shared with other prisoners. There was no privacy, no dignity. You slept in a heap with other men, pressed together for warmth, trying to ignore the sounds of your neighbor's breathing, his cough, his moans. The straw was changed rarely, and the privy was a bucket in the corner. The smell alone would have been enough to drive a person mad, but people adapted. They learned to breathe through their mouths, to focus on some distant sound, to retreat into the inner world of their own mind. And when sleep came, it was a mercy, a brief respite from the cramped and stinking reality. One of the most curious medieval sleeping arrangements was the use of the oubliette. The word comes from the French oublier, to forget. And that is exactly what the oubliette was: a small, deep pit, often with a trap door at the top, into which a prisoner was lowered and then simply forgotten. There was no room to lie down in an oubliette. They were often only 3 or 4 feet in diameter and 6 or 7 feet deep. The prisoner stood or crouched or sat in a shallow pool of water that had seeped through the stone. Sleep was impossible, or nearly so. A prisoner might manage to doze leaning against the curved wall, but any movement would splash the water and startle them awake. These were not sleeping places. They were dying places. But the oubliette is a dramatic image, and it looms large in our imagination of the medieval prison. The truth is that most prisoners were not in oubliettes. Most were in rooms, even if those rooms were cold and dark. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval prison sleep is that it was not solitary. Prisons were crowded. People were thrown in together, men and women sometimes, though often separated by gender. Children were imprisoned too, especially as hostages or as punishment for their parents. A prisoner's sleep was always accompanied by the sounds of others: the weeping, the coughing, the prayers, the arguments. There was no silence, and in that noise there was a strange kind of community. Prisoners formed bonds. They shared food, they shared blankets, they shared their few possessions. They told each other stories, they sang songs, they recited poems. And when one of them died, which happened often, The others would take care of the body until the guards came to remove it. Sleep in such a place was a collective act. You drifted off together, and you woke together, and you endured together. There is a story about a knight imprisoned in a tower in Scotland in the 15th century. He was kept in a room at the very top of the keep, with a single arrow loop that faced north. He could see the mountains in the distance, and he would watch the light change on the slopes as the hours passed. When night fell, he would lie down on his stone ledge, and he would try to count the hours until dawn. But he found that the best way to sleep was to imagine himself outside, walking through those mountains. He would picture each step, the feel of the grass under his feet, the wind on his face. He would imagine crossing a stream, climbing a hill, reaching a summit. And by the time he reached the top of the imaginary hill, he would be asleep. This is not unique. Many prisoners throughout history have used the power of the mind to create a sleeping place that the body could not find. They built imaginary beds, imaginary rooms, imaginary landscapes, and they slept in those places instead. The medieval prison was not only a physical space, but a psychological one. The stone, the chains, the cold, the rats, the noise, the smell, all of these things pressed in on a person day and night. And sleep was the only escape, the only time when the prison could not touch you. But even then, the prison followed you into your dreams. The sound of dripping water, the rattle of chains, these things became part of your inner world, woven into your dreams like threads of iron in a soft cloth. You might dream of being free, of running through a meadow, but even in the dream, there was a weight on your ankle, a shadow at the edge of your vision. Freedom was always just out of reach, even in sleep. Now, let us go deeper into the stone. Let us consider the beds themselves, or the lack of them. In many prisons, there was no pallet at all. The prisoner simply lay on the stone floor, perhaps with their arms folded under their head for a pillow. The stone was cold, but after a while, your body heat would warm a small area, and you would shift to a new spot, like an animal making its bed in a patch of sun. But there was no sun here, only the faint glow of a torch from the corridor, or the darkness that was so completed felt like a blanket. Some prisoners claimed that they could see colors in the darkness, swirls of purple and green that danced behind their eyelids. This is a known phenomenon, the phosphene, the light that the brain creates when there is no light at all. And so medieval prisoners slept with their own inner fireworks, a private show that no guard could take away from them. There is a peculiar tenderness in the way we can imagine these prisoners. They were not just statistics. They were people. They had names, faces, lives. They had mothers who worried about them, children who missed them, sweethearts who wept for them. And at night, alone in their cells, they thought of those people. They thought of a warm fire, a soft bed, a hand in theirs. They thought of the last meal they had eaten before they were taken, the last time they had felt the sun on their skin. And then, slowly, they drifted into sleep, into that other world where the prison walls fell away, and they were free, if only for a few hours. And when they woke, the stone was still there, the chains were still there, the cold was still there. But the memory of the dream lingered, a faint warmth that carried them through the morning. So tonight, as you settle into your own bed, perhaps under a soft duvet, with a pillow that you can fluff and arrange, think of those medieval sleepers. Think of the knight in the Scottish tower, the merchant in the London vault, the peasant in the oubliette. They slept on stone, in chains, in the dark, and yet they slept. They found a way to rest, even in the most unforgiving of places. And there is something peaceful in that, something almost reassuring. It reminds us that sleep is a powerful thing, a force that can overcome even the coldest and darkest of circumstances. The medieval prison was a harsh place, but it was also a place of endurance, of resilience, of the quiet human habit of closing your eyes and letting go, no matter where you are. We will continue this journey in a moment, but first, let us pause and let the image of that stone bed settle into your mind. The rough surface, the faint chill, the sound of wind through a slit window, and then the slow, deep breath of someone falling asleep, someone who has learned to find comfort in the cold, peace in the dark. That is the story of how medieval prisoners slept. But it is also the story of how we all sleep, in our own way, every night, trusting that the world will still be there when we wake. And so, let us return to those stone chambers, to the quiet rustle of straw and the distant drip of water. There are many more stories to tell about how medieval prisoners found rest in the most unlikely places, stories that speak to the strange resilience of the human spirit. Each prison was different, you see. Not every cell was a deep dungeon or a cramped oubliette. Some prisoners were housed in the gatehouse towers of castles, rooms that were once used by soldiers, but had been converted into makeshift jails. These rooms often had windows, or at least arrow slits, and a prisoner might catch a glimpse of the sky, a sliver of blue or gray that reminded him of the world outside. He could see the stars at night, if he craned his neck just so, and that small comfort could be enough to carry him through another long darkness. The stars were the same stars he had seen as a child, and they connected him to a life that still existed somewhere beyond the walls. In other cases, prisoners were held in the basements of town halls or in the towers of city gates. These were not the dark pits of legend, but actual rooms with floors, sometimes even with wooden planks laid over the stone. A prisoner might have a blanket, if he was lucky, or a pile of straw that had been brought in fresh that month. The straw would be spread thick and soft, and a man could burrow into it like an animal preparing for winter, letting the dry stalks cradle his body. The smell of fresh straw is a comforting smell, earthy and clean, and it could mask the odors of the prison, if only for a time. Prisoners would hoard the best straw for their bedding, tucking it into corners, shaping it into a kind of nest. And when the guards came to change the straw, which happened only a few times a year, the whole cell would take on a new mood, a sense of renewal that was almost festive. The old straw would be raked out, carrying with it the filth and the insects, and the new straw would be spread, golden and fragrant. That night, sleep would come easily, a deep and grateful rest. but the straw was a luxury. In many prisons, there was no straw at all, or it was so old and matted that it served only as a breeding ground for lice and fleas. The prisoners would lie directly on the stone, and the stone would draw the heat from their bodies slowly, relentlessly. There is a particular kind of cold that comes from stone, a cold that seeps into the bones and stays there, even after you have moved away. Prisoners who slept on stone for months would develop a constant ache in their joints, a stiffness that never fully left them. And yet, the body adapts. It learns to curl into a tight ball, to tuck the hands under the armpits, to breathe slowly and evenly to conserve warmth. Some prisoners would rub their feet together to generate heat, a small and repetitive motion that could become almost meditative. They would close their eyes and focus on the rub, the rub, the rub, until the sensation filled their entire awareness, and the cold began to recede, just a little. There's a story about a woman imprisoned in a tower in the south of France in the 13th century. She was the wife of a nobleman who had fallen out of favor with the local count. Her husband was executed, and she was taken to a round tower that overlooked a river. The room she was kept in had a single window, set high in the wall, through which she could hear the sound of water. At night, when the wind was right, she could hear the river lapping against the stones of the tower, a gentle and rhythmic sound. She learned to match her breathing to that sound, in and out, like the tide. And in this way, she would drift into a sleep that was almost peaceful, despite the chains that bound her ankles. She later said that the river became her companion, her lullaby, and that even in the darkest moments, she could hear it and be comforted. She survived 2 years in that tower before being ransomed, and she always said that it was the water that kept her sane. Sleep in prison was not always a surrender. Sometimes it was an act of defiance. There were prisoners who refused to sleep, who stayed awake out of fear that the guards would harm them in the night, or out of a stubborn determination not to give in to the conditions. But the body has its limits. After a few days without sleep, the mind begins to fray, and the world becomes strange. Hallucinations creep in at the edges of vision. You might see a face in the stone, or hear a voice calling your name. And then, eventually, you collapse, and sleep takes you whether you want it or not. The guards knew this, of course. Sleep deprivation was a common form of torture, a way to break a prisoner's will without leaving marks. They would interrupt sleep at regular intervals, banging on the door, splashing water, shouting in the night. A prisoner who had not slept in days was pliable, confused, willing to say anything. And so, for those who could manage it, sleep became a kind of victory. Each hour of rest was a small triumph over the guards, a refusal to let them win. There is a term that historians use, the prison sleep cycle. It describes how prisoners adapted to the unnatural rhythms of confinement. Without natural light, without the cues of sunrise and sunset, the body's internal clock goes haywire. Prisoners would sleep for a few hours, then wake for a few hours, then sleep again, a pattern that could continue around the clock. They would lose track of days, weeks, months. Some kept a tally on the wall with a nail or a sharp stone, scratching a line for each dawn. But if the guards scraped the marks away, the prisoner would be lost, adrift in an endless gray time. In such circumstances, sleep was the only marker. You woke up, and that meant a new day had begun, even if you had no idea which day it was. And you would tell yourself, I have slept, therefore I am still alive. Tonight I will sleep again, and that will be proof that I can survive another day. The relationship between prisoners and their beds, if we can call them beds, was intimate and personal. Some prisoners developed rituals around sleep. They would arrange their chains in a certain way so that the metal did not dig into their wrists as they lay down. They would place their shoes under their head as a pillow, or fold their coat into a pad for their hips. They would say a prayer, or recite a poem, or sing a song under their breath. These small acts of order were a way of asserting control in a place where they had none. And when they lay down, they would imagine a bed, a real bed, with a feather mattress and linen sheets. They would picture it in perfect detail: the wooden frame, the color of the canopy, the pattern on the quilt. And they would imagine climbing into that bed, sinking into the softness, feeling the warmth of the sheets. Some prisoners claimed that if they concentrated hard enough, they could actually feel the imaginary bed under them, that their minds could create a phantom comfort that was almost as good as the real thing. There is a record from a prison in London, the Fleet Prison, from the late 14th century. The cell was in the basement, and it was known for its dampness. The walls wept moisture, and a thin film of water covered the floor. The prisoners had to sleep on raised platforms, wooden planks set on stone supports, to keep them above the water. But the planks were rough and splintered, and they would catch at clothing and skin. The prisoners learned to smooth the planks with their hands, rubbing them over and over until they became polished and soft. Over years, the wood would take on a sheen from the constant touch, and it would become warm to the lip, a small pocket of comfort in the cold. And when a new prisoner arrived, the old prisoners would show him the best spot, the spot where the planks had been worn smooth by generations of sleepers. It was a kindness, a passing of knowledge from one weary soul to another. And then there were the rats. Every medieval prison had rats, and they were a constant companion. They would come out at night, drawn by the warmth and the smell of food. The prisoners could hear them scratching in the corners, squeaking, fighting. Some prisoners were terrified of them, lying rigid and awake, listening for the sound of teeth on bone. Others found a strange comfort in their presence. The rats were living things, and they shared the space. A prisoner might learn to ignore them, or even to find amusement in their antics. There are stories of prisoners who tamed rats, who would save crumbs from their meals to feed to a particular rat, who would come when called. And in the night, the rat would curl up next to the prisoner's side, a small warm body, a beating heart. It was not a dog or a cat, but it was a companion, and it made the darkness a little less lonely. The prisoner would fall asleep with his hand close to the rat, feeling its small vibrations, and the rat would sleep too. And for a few hours, they were together in a way that transcended species. Sleep in the medieval prison was also a time of vulnerability. A prisoner who slept deeply might not hear the guard approaching, might not feel the cold seeping in, might not notice that the fire in the far corner had gone out. And there was always the fear of being attacked in the night. Prisons were violent places, and even among prisoners, there were quarrels and grudges. A man might wake to find his throat cut, his possessions taken. And so, sleep was often light, a doze rather than a deep rest. Prisoners learned to sleep with one eye open, to wake at the slightest sound. They would sleep in shifts, taking turns watching over each other. One prisoner would keep vigil while the others slept, and then they would trade places. This was not a formal arrangement, just a quiet understanding among the desperate. And in this way, they protected each other, and they slept as much as they could, knowing that outside the walls, the world was still spinning, still waiting for them. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval prison sleep is that it happened at all. Given the cold, the damp, the noise, the fear, the hunger, it seems impossible that anyone could find rest. And yet they did. The human body demands sleep, and it will find a way, even in the most hostile environments. We know from modern studies that prisoners in solitary confinement often sleep more than they did before, that the mind retreats into sleep as a form of protection. And medieval prisoners were no different. Sleep was their refuge, their escape, their friend. And when they woke, they were able to face the day, or the night, or whatever came next. The stone did not change. The chains did not loosen. But they had rested, and that was enough. So let us take a moment now to consider the silence of that kind of sleep. Imagine the cell, deep in the stone, far from any window. The torch in the corridor has been extinguished for the night. The darkness is absolute, a darkness you could touch if you reached out your hand. And in that darkness, a man breathes, slowly and evenly. He is asleep. His chains are quiet. His body is still. He has found a moment of peace, and it belongs to him alone. Somewhere above, the moon rises over the castle walls, but he does not see it. He sees only the inside of his own eyelids, and that is enough. He is sleeping, and while he sleeps, he is free. And yet, there is another kind of sleep in the medieval prison, one that we have not yet explored. It is the sleep of those who were held not in deep dungeons, but in the upper chambers of towers, where the walls were thinner, and the light crept in through narrow arrow slits. You might think that would be a better condition, but it came with its own peculiar torments. The wind would whistle through those slits, sharp and cold, and the stone floor was no softer than in the basement. The prisoner in a tower cell had a view, if you could call it that, a sliver of sky, a patch of cloud, perhaps the distant shape of a tree. But that view was a reminder of what he could not touch. He would watch the sun rise and set through his slit, marking the days, and at night he would see the stars, small and distant, taunting him with their freedom. And when he lay down to sleep, he would feel the wind on his face, and he would imagine that if he could only reach through that slit, he could touch the outside world. But his chains stopped him, and he would curl up against the wall, trying to find a spot where the draft did not reach. It was a sleep haunted by the nearness of the world. In some tower cells, there was a small fireplace, though it was rarely lit. The guard might bring a brazier on particularly cold nights, but that was a luxury. More often, the prisoner had to rely on his own body heat, wrapping himself in his cloak, pulling his knees to his chest, and shivering until exhaustion took him. There is a record from the castle of Vincennes, just outside Paris, from the early 15th century. A nobleman named Jean de Chalon was held in a tower room for several months. He wrote letters to his family, describing his sleeping arrangements. He had a pile of straw, which he changed once a week if he was lucky, and a single blanket that was thin and moth-eaten. He complained that the straw was full of fleas and that he would wake covered in bites. But he also noted that after a few weeks, he grew accustomed to the fleas. They became part of the rhythm of his sleep, the little tickling sensations that would wake him, the scratching that would follow, and then the return to slumber. He wrote that he learned to sleep between the bites, that his body stopped reacting to the minor irritations, and he found that his mind, too, adjusted. He would think of the fleas as tiny guardians, keeping him from falling into too deep a sleep. They were a distraction, but a manageable one, and in a strange way, they made the night less lonely. Then there were the oubliettes, a word that comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget. These were bottle-shaped pits, often in the floor of a dungeon, with a narrow opening at the top and a wider chamber below. The prisoner was lowered in on a rope, and then the rope was pulled up, leaving him in the dark. The walls were smooth and slimy, and the floor was dirt or rock. To sleep in an oubliette was to sleep in a hole, where the only sound was your own breathing and the occasional drip of water. Some oubliettes had a small drainage channel, so the water would not pool, but others did not, and the prisoner would lie in a shallow puddle, his clothes growing heavy and cold. Sleep in such a place was not a restful thing. It was a kind of hibernation, a shutting down of the mind to escape the horror of the position. Prisoners in oubliettes often reported dreams of being buried alive, of the walls closing in, of the darkness pressing down on their chest. They would wake gasping, and for a moment they would not know where they were, and then they would remember, and the weight of the darkness would return. And yet they would sleep again, because there was nothing else to do. The body demands rest, even when the mind screams against it. I have often wondered about the dream lives of medieval prisoners. What did they dream about? We have a few accounts, mostly from memoirs written by those who were released. One man, a merchant imprisoned for debt in the city of Florence in the late 13th century, wrote that he dreamed of his wife's face. He would see her leaning over him, her hair falling around her shoulders, and she would touch his forehead and smile. And in the dream, he could smell the lavender she used in her washing, a scent that had long faded from his memory. He would wake with tears on his cheeks, and he would lie in the dark and try to hold onto the image. Another prisoner, a knight held in the Tower of London, dreamed of horses. He would be riding across a field, the wind in his hair, the sound of hooves beneath him. And then the dream would slip away, and he would find himself again on the cold stone his ankles chained to a ring in the wall. He said that those dreams were the worst because they gave him hope, and hope was a dangerous thing in a prison. It made the waking world feel even more crushing. But there were also dreams of escape. Many prisoners reported dreams in which they found a hidden door, or a rope ladder, or a guard who smiled and unlocked their chains. They would walk out of the cell and into the sunlight, and they would run and run until they were far away. And then they would wake, and for a few glorious seconds, they would believe it was real. They would feel the ground beneath their feet, the air on their skin, and then the cold stone would remind them, and the chains would clink, and the dream would die. Some prisoners learned to avoid those dreams, to train themselves to dream only of small, safe things, like a loaf of bread or a warm fire. They would repeat a mantra as they fell asleep, telling themselves to dream of nothing, just a blank void. And sometimes it worked. They would fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, and they would wake feeling as if no time had passed at all. That kind of sleep was a mercy, a small death that gave them a few hours of oblivion. And then there were the prisoners who could not sleep at all. For them, the nights were endless, a slow crawl of darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. They would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the prison, the creaking of the guards' boots in the corridor, the distant laughter from a tavern outside the walls, the howl of a dog. They would count the stones in the ceiling, tracing the cracks with their eyes, memorizing every imperfection. They would recite prayers, poems, the names of their children over and over, like a litany. And still sleep would not come. The lack of sleep would drive them to the edge of madness. They would see shapes in the darkness, hear voices that were not there. They would startle at every sound, their nerves frayed and raw. The guards would find them in the morning, staring at the wall, their eyes red and vacant. And sometimes, after many days of sleeplessness, the prisoner would simply collapse, his body giving out, and he would sleep for a day or more, a dead sleep, a sleep that was almost a coma. And when he woke, he would be weak but rested, and the cycle would begin again. I recall a story from the prison of Newgate in London, from the early 16th century. A woman was held there, accused of witchcraft. She was kept in a cell that was barely large enough to lie down in, and she was not allowed any bedding, only the bare stone. The guards deliberately kept her awake, banging on her door at all hours, pouring cold water through a grate in the ceiling. They wanted a confession, but the woman was stubborn. She learned to sleep in tiny increments between the interruptions. She would close her eyes for a minute, 2 minutes, snatching rest where she could. The guards thought they were breaking her, but in fact she was adapting, her body learning to survive on fragments of sleep. After 3 weeks, she was still awake, still refusing to confess. The guards grew tired of the game, and they left her alone. And then she slept, truly slept, for a full night. She said later that she had dreamed of her mother's kitchen, of the smell of baking bread, of the warmth of the hearth. And when she woke, she felt strong enough to face another day. She was eventually released when the accuser recanted, and she lived to be an old woman, and she always said that the most precious thing in the world was a full night's sleep. There is something profound about the way the human mind can turn a prison cell into a bedroom. It is a testament to our ability to adapt, to find comfort in the smallest things. A stone that has been warmed by the sun for a few hours becomes a luxury. A dry patch of floor becomes a sanctuary. A piece of cloth, folded just so, becomes a pillow. The prisoner learns to see not the dungeon, but the potential for rest. He learns to ignore the cold, the damp, the noise. He learns to focus on the breath, on the rhythm of his own heart, on the tiny movements of his body as he settles into the least uncomfortable position. And then, when sleep comes, it is a gift, a moment of grace. It does not matter that the world outside is indifferent. For those few hours, the prisoner is not a prisoner. He is just a person sleeping. So let us return now to the silence we imagined earlier. The man is still sleeping in his cell, deep in the stone. The darkness is complete, and his breathing is steady. Somewhere above, the moon has set, and the world is quiet. The guard has dozed off in his chair, the keys hanging loose in his hand. The rats have retreated to their nests. The fleas are still active, but the man does not feel them. He is far away, in a place where there are no walls, no chains, no cold. He is walking through a meadow, or sitting by a fire, or holding someone's hand. It does not matter where. What matters is that he is there, and that for a little while he is free. And when he wakes, he will remember that feeling, and it will sustain him through another day of stone and darkness. That is the power of sleep. That is the quiet triumph of the medieval prisoner. And there were many such triumphs, small and quiet, that history has nearly forgotten. The medieval prisoner, you see, was not always a figure of utter despair, though the conditions were harsh beyond what we can easily imagine today. There were moments of adaptation, of resilience, of finding a sliver of warmth in the cold stone. Consider, if you will, the seasons. A prison in summer was a very different place from a prison in winter, and the prisoner learned to adjust his sleeping habits accordingly. In summer, the stone might hold the heat of the day for a few hours after sunset, and the prisoner would lie on the warmest patch of floor, his limbs spread out, trying to catch any stray breeze that might find its way through a high window or a crack in the wall. The air would be thick and still, and the fleas would be active, jumping from the straw to his skin. But the warmth was a comfort after the chill of the damp. He would sleep lightly, waking often to scratch or to shift positions, but the long daylight hours gave him more time to rest, and the summer nights felt mercifully short. But winter was another ordeal entirely. The cold crept into the bones, and the stone floor became a block of ice. The prisoner would curl into a tight ball, his knees drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs, trying to conserve every scrap of body heat. He might have a handful of straw spread thin, but it would soon become damp and matted, offering little insulation. The guards, if they were kind, might toss a worn blanket into the cell, but such kindness was rare. More often, the prisoner would have to rely on the warmth of his own breath, cupping his hands over his mouth and nose, or burying his face in the crook of his arm. The cold made sleep difficult, but it also made sleep necessary. The body demanded rest to conserve energy, and the prisoner would often slip into a drowsy, half-conscious state, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, a kind of torpor that dulled the ache of the cold. I recall a story from a monastery prison in France, where a monk was confined for some minor disobedience. He wrote later that he learned to sleep in short bursts, no more than an hour at a time, because the cold would wake him, his teeth chattering, his limbs stiff. He would then get up and walk in a small circle, stamping his feet and rubbing his arms until the blood began to flow again, and then he would lie down and try to sleep once more. He said that the worst part was not the cold itself, but the knowledge that the cold would never truly leave. It was always there, waiting, and sleep was just a temporary reprieve. And then there were the prisoners who shared their cells. In many medieval prisons, it was common for several prisoners to be held together in a single room, sometimes chained to the same wall. This might seem like a cruelty, but it often became a source of comfort. At night, the prisoners would huddle together, lying side by side, sharing their body heat. They would sleep back to back, or with one prisoner's head resting on another's shoulder, like a litter of puppies seeking warmth. The intimacy was not romantic, but practical, a survival mechanism born of necessity. The prisoners would whisper to each other in the dark, telling stories to pass the time, or reciting prayers, or simply murmuring reassurances. The sound of another human voice, even a frightened one, was a reminder that they were not alone. And when sleep finally came, it was deeper and more restful than sleeping alone, because the heat of another body was a shield against the cold. There is a record from the prison of Newgate in the 15th century, where a group of debtors were held together in a large underground room. The room had a single fireplace, but it was rarely lit, so the prisoners would press together on the floor, using their cloaks and coats as blankets. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Night, and they took turns sleeping on the outside of the group, where the cold was worst. It was a small act of kindness, but it made all the difference. But not all prisoners had the luxury of company. Many were held in solitary cells, alone with their thoughts and the darkness. For these prisoners, sleep was a lonely affair, a descent into a world where no one else could follow. The absence of human contact could drive a person to madness, and many prisoners spoke to themselves or to imagined companions. Some would talk to the rats, giving them names and chatting with them as if they were old friends. The rats, of course, paid no attention, but the act of speaking aloud helped the prisoner feel connected to the world. Others would sing softly in the dark hymns or folk songs from their childhood, repeating the same verses over and over until they fell asleep. The sound of their own voice was a lullaby, a familiar comfort in an unfamiliar place. I remember a story from the dungeons of the Tower of London, where a man named John Barrett, a prisoner in the early 16th century, was held in a small cell for several years. He later wrote that he learned to sing himself to sleep every night, a particular song that his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. The song spoke of a shepherd who watched his flock by night, and John would imagine himself as that shepherd, lying on a grassy hill under a starry sky. And in that imagining, he would find peace, and his breathing would slow, and his eyelids would grow heavy. He said that the song became a kind of prayer, a gateway to a better place. And then there were those who slept with their eyes open, or at least halfway open. This was a common sight in medieval prisons. A prisoner lying motionless on the floor, his eyes glazed and unfocused, but still awake, staring at the darkness. This state was known as the vigil of the condemned, and it was a kind of suspended animation where the prisoner was neither fully asleep nor fully alert. The mind would drift, sliding into half-formed dreams, but the body would remain tense, ready to respond to any sound. The prisoner would hear every drip of water, every scurry of a rat, every distant footstep, but he would not react. He would simply lie there, floating on the edge of consciousness, waiting for the night to pass. It was a restless sleep, but it was still rest, and the body accepted it gratefully. I recall a curious account from the prison of the Bastille, where a prisoner named Pierre de Bourbon, a nobleman, described his own sleep as a kind of trance. He would lie on his straw pallet and count his own breaths, 100, 200, 300, until the numbers became meaningless and his mind began to wander. He said that he could sometimes feel his soul leaving his body, floating up to the ceiling and looking down at his own form lying on the floor. It was a strange sensation, both comforting and unsettling, and he would sometimes wake with a start, thinking he was falling from a great height. But he also said that those moments of detachment were the closest he ever came to true freedom. The physical toll of sleeping on stone cannot be overstated. The body was not designed for such hardness, and the prisoners often suffered from chronic pain in their hips, shoulders, and backs. They would develop bed sores, especially on the parts of the body that pressed against the floor. The skin would become raw, then infected, and the pain would make sleep even more elusive. Some prisoners would try to construct a makeshift bed from whatever materials they could find: a pile of straw, a few rags, a piece of wood that had fallen from a broken crate. But these were meager comforts, and they often made the problem worse. Damp straw would mold, and the mold would cause respiratory problems, making it difficult to breathe during the night. The prisoner would wake coughing, his chest tight, his eyes watering. And yet, he would still lie down again, because the alternative was to stand, and standing was exhausting in a different way. The body craved horizontal rest, even if that rest came with pain. And so, the medieval prisoner became a master of compromise. He learned to sleep in positions that minimized discomfort, turning onto his side, curling his knees up, resting his head on his arm. He would arrange his straw into a small mound, just enough to lift his head and shoulders off the ground. He would fold his cloak or tunic into a pillow, or use a stone that was slightly softer than the others. I have read of one prisoner, a man named William Lee, who was held in the Fleet Prison in London in the 14th century. He was a wealthy merchant, and he had managed to bribe the guards to bring him a wooden plank. He would lay this plank on the floor, and then he would cover it with his cloak, and he said that it felt like a bed of feathers compared to the bare stone. He wrote to his wife that he had never appreciated the softness of a mattress until he had lost it, and his wife, ever resourceful, sent him a bag of wool, which he could use as a cushion. The guards allowed it because the wool could not be used as a weapon, and William slept more comfortably than any other prisoner in the fleet. But such luxuries were rare, and most prisoners had to make do with the floor and their own ingenuity. There is a certain humility in the way the medieval prisoner approached sleep. He did not expect comfort, nor did he demand it. He took what he could get and was grateful for it. A dry patch of floor, a few hours without interruption, a dream that felt real, these were treasures beyond price. And the mind, in its infinite adaptability, learned to find contentment in the smallest things. The sound of rain on the roof, for example, could be a soothing lullaby, drowning out the noise of the prison. The drip of water from a leak in the ceiling could become a steady rhythm, like a ticking clock, marking the passage of time. The prisoner would focus on that sound, letting it fill his awareness, and the rest of the world would fade away. He would breathe in time with the drip, slow and deep, and his body would relax. It was a form of meditation, a way of escaping the prison without leaving the cell. And sometimes the prisoner would be granted a sleep that was truly deep, a sleep without dreams, a sleep that felt like a blanket of darkness. This was the best kind of sleep because it gave the mind a complete rest. The prisoner would wake with a sense of disorientation, not knowing where he was, and for a few precious seconds, he would be free. Then the reality of the cell would return, but the memory of that deep sleep would stay with him, a reminder that his body was still strong, that he could still rest. This deep sleep was often accompanied by a feeling of warmth, as if the stone floor had absorbed the heat of his body and was giving it back to him. He would lie there, perfectly still, his muscles limp, his mind blank, and the world would cease to exist. It was a moment of grace, a gift from the unknown, and the prisoner would hold on to it like a talisman. I remember a curious detail from the annals of the French prison of Chatelet. A scribe named Jean de Mézières was imprisoned there for debt, and he kept a journal of his nights. He wrote that on certain nights, when the moon was full and the sky was clear, a beam of light would shine through a high window in his cell, casting a pale rectangle on the floor. He would move his straw so that the light fell on his face, and he would lie there, feeling the moonlight on his skin. He said that it was like being touched by a ghost, a gentle caress from the world above. And he would fall asleep in that light, and his dreams would be brighter, filled with images of gardens and rivers and open fields. The moonlight became his companion, a silent friend that visited him at night and left before dawn. He wrote that he looked forward to the full moon more than anything else, and that it gave him the strength to endure the dark days between. And so the medieval prisoner found his own ways to sleep, his own small rituals, his own quiet triumphs. He slept on stone, in dampness, in cold, in darkness, but he slept. He dreamed of better places, of warm fires, of loved ones, of freedom. And sometimes, just sometimes, he slept without dreaming at all. And that was the greatest gift of all. There's a lesson in this, perhaps, for all of us who complain about our soft pillows and our climate-controlled bedrooms. The medieval prisoner did not have those things, and yet he still found rest. He still closed his eyes and let the night take him, trusting that the morning would come, for better or for worse. And that trust, that quiet acceptance, is perhaps the most human thing of all. It is the thread that connects us across centuries, a shared experience that transcends time and place. When you lie down tonight in your warm bed, with your soft blanket and your comfortable pillow, think of the medieval prisoner sleeping on the cold stone, and let his story be a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. And then let yourself drift off into the gentle darkness, into the quiet sleep that is our common inheritance. But there is another story, one that takes us to a different tower, far from the bustling streets of Paris and the damp walls of the Chatelet. It is the story of a man named Geoffrey de Montfort, a knight imprisoned in the Tower of London in the 14th century. He was held in the Bowyer Tower, a round stone chamber with walls that seemed to sweat in the summer and weep in the winter. Geoffrey wrote letters to his sister, describing his nights in that tower, and his words have survived the centuries. He said that the tower was so cold that his breath would freeze on the stone above his head, forming a layer of frost that glittered in the pale light of dawn. He would lie on a pile of straw that was barely thicker than a blanket, and he would wrap himself in his cloak, but the cold would still seep through, creeping into his bones like a slow poison. His sleep was a shallow thing, a kind of half-conscious drifting that left him more tired in the morning than he had been the night before. He would hear the rats scuttling in the straw, and he would feel them sometimes, running across his legs, their tiny claws like needles. He learned to ignore them, because to fight them was to lose sleep, and sleep was too precious. He would lie still and listen to the wind howling through the cracks in the mortar, a sound like the moaning of the dead. And he would think of his own death, wondering if it would come before the spring, before the warmth returned. But then he would remember that he was a knight, and knights did not whimper in the dark. He would clench his jaw and force his eyes to close, and he would will himself to sleep, as if sleep could be commanded like a servant. And sometimes it worked. He would slip under the surface of consciousness into a dream world where he was free. He would ride through green fields, his horse strong beneath him, the sun warm on his face. He would hear the sound of trumpets and the cheers of his men. But the dream would always end the same way. He would find himself back in the tower, cold and alone, and he would wake with a start, his heart pounding. He said that the waking was worse than the dream, because the dream had given him hope, and hope was a cruel thing in a prison cell. He would lie there shaking, and he would tell himself that the dream was a gift, that it had given him a few moments of happiness, and he should be grateful for that. But gratitude was hard to muster when the cold was biting and the rats were pressing close. There's a certain pathos in the sleep of the medieval prisoner, a quality that is both tragic and beautiful. They slept in the shadow of death, and yet they slept. They dreamed of life, and they clung to those dreams as if they were real. And sometimes the dreams became so vivid that they blurred the line between the cell and the world outside. I recall the story of a monk named Thomas of Hales, who was imprisoned in the dungeon of a castle in the Welsh marches. He was a man of deep faith, and he spent his nights in prayer and meditation. He said that he learned to sleep in a state of constant vigilance, so that his body rested, but his spirit remained awake. He would lie on the stone floor and recite the Psalms silently in his mind, and the rhythm of the words would lull him into a trance. He would see the words as lights, dancing in the darkness, and he would follow them into a state of ecstasy. He said that in those moments, the walls of the dungeon dissolved, and he was standing in the presence of God. But even the most devout prisoner could not sustain such a state forever. The body would tire, and the mind would wander, and the ecstasy would fade. Thomas wrote that he would often wake with a start, finding himself curled on the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold stone, his hands numb from the cold. He would pray for forgiveness for his weakness, and then he would try to find a comfortable position, shifting his weight, adjusting his head. He would dream of his monastery, of the warm bed in the dormitory, of the sound of the bell calling the monks to matins, and he would feel a deep longing, a homesickness that was more painful than any physical discomfort. But he would remind himself that his suffering was a form of penance, a way of purifying his soul, and he would fall asleep again, his lips moving in silent prayer. The sleep of the medieval prisoner was also shaped by the nature of his crime. A debtor's prison was different from a state prison, and a state prison was different from a religious prison. In the Fleet prison in London, the debtors often had more freedom than the prisoners in the Tower. They could receive visitors, they could buy food and bedding, and they could even arrange for a proper bed to be brought in. But even in the Fleet, the nights were long and cold. I remember the account of a merchant named Richard Lacey, who was imprisoned for debt in the reign of Edward III. He had the good fortune to be able to afford a small bed, a wooden frame with rope springs, and a straw mattress. He wrote to his wife that he felt like a king compared to the other prisoners, who slept on the floor. But he also said that the bed was not much comfort, because the rope springs sagged and the straw was lumpy. He would lie awake, listening to the groans and coughs of the men around him, the clanking of chains, the sound of the guards' footsteps on the stone corridor. He said it was like trying to sleep in a marketplace, except the marketplace was dark and full of despair. And yet, he did sleep. He would close his eyes and focus on the smell of the straw, the rough texture of the blanket against his skin. He would count the hours until dawn, judging by the changing sounds of the prison, the shift of the guards, the first light filtering through the high windows. He would dream of his shop, of the goods he had sold, of the creditors he owed. And he would wake with a start, his heart racing, thinking that the bailiffs had come to take him away. But the bailiffs did not come at night, and he would remind himself of that, and he would try to relax. He would turn over, punch the mattress, and try to find a soft spot. It was never enough, but it was something. In the country prisons, the situation was often worse. The towers of remote castles were damp and drafty, and the stone walls were thick with centuries of cold. I think of a prisoner held in the castle of Corfe in Dorset, a man named William de la Mare, who was accused of treason. He was held in the Gloriette, a small tower that overlooked a steep ravine. The wind would howl through the cracks in the walls, and the rain would seep through the roof. He would lie on a bed of straw that was soon soaked through, and he would shiver all night, unable to warm himself. He said in his testimony that he would sometimes wake to find that his clothes had frozen to the stone floor, so that he had to peel himself away in the morning. He would try to sleep in a sitting position, leaning against the wall, but the cold would still find him. He would wrap his arms around his knees and rock back and forth, trying to generate heat. It was a pitiful sight, but he was alone, and no one saw. The guards would sometimes bring him a blanket, but it was thin and threadbare, and it did little good. He would lie under it, shivering, and he would wonder if he would ever feel warm again. He would think of the fire in the great hall, of the heat that he had once taken for granted, and he would weep silently so that no one could hear. But even in his despair, he would sleep. The body's need for rest is stronger than any discomfort, and he would eventually drift off, his mind numb with cold and exhaustion. He would dream of summer, of the sun on his face, of a meadow full of flowers. And the dream would be so real that he would reach out to touch the flowers, and his hand would hit the cold stone, and he would wake. But the memory of the dream would stay with him, and he would hold on to it throughout the long, dark day. There is a kind of beauty in the way these prisoners slept, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They did not have the luxury of a soft pillow or a warm blanket, but they found a way to rest. They learned to adapt, to find comfort in the smallest things, to create their own rituals of sleep. They counted their breaths, they listened to the rain, they felt the moonlight on their faces, and in that they found a kind of peace. It is a peace that we can all learn from, a reminder that sleep is not about comfort, but about surrender, a letting go of the world and all its troubles. And as you lie in your own bed tonight, with your soft mattress and your warm duvet, perhaps you can think of those prisoners, of their cold stone floors and their thin straw beds. And perhaps you can feel a little gratitude for what you have, and a little sympathy for what they endured. And then, perhaps, you can close your eyes and let the quiet darkness take you, just as it took them, century after century, into the gentle, forgiving arms of sleep. But before you do, let us consider one more story, a final glimpse into the night of a medieval prisoner. This one comes from the records of the Tower of London, from the reign of Henry VIII, a time when the tower was crowded with those who had fallen out of favor with the king. There was a man named Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, who had risen from humble beginnings to the heights of power. And then, in the summer of 1540, he fell. He was arrested on charges of treason and heresy, and he was taken to the tower, to a cell in the Beauchamp Tower, a room that had seen many prisoners before him. He was a man of great intelligence, a master of politics and law, but now he was alone in a cold stone room with nothing but his thoughts. The cell in the Beauchamp Tower was not the worst in the tower. It had a fireplace, though it was rarely lit, and a window that let in a little light. But for Cromwell, it was a prison, and he knew that death was near. He had seen many men go to the block, and he had signed more than a few death warrants himself. Now he was on the other side. He wrote letters to the king, pleading for mercy, but he knew that mercy was unlikely. And so he prepared himself for the end. But in the meantime, he had to sleep. He slept on a straw mattress, laid on a wooden platform with a thin blanket. He found that sleep came easily at first, because he was exhausted from the stress and the fear. But his dreams were troubled. He would dream of the court, of the king's face, of the accusations that had been made against him. He would dream of his wife and his children, of the home he had lost. And he would wake in the pitch black, his heart pounding, his hands clutching the blanket. He would lie there, listening to the sounds of the tower, the footsteps of the guards, the distant clang of a door, the rustle of rats in the walls. And he would try to compose himself, to recite the prayers he had learned as a boy. He would say them in his mind, slowly, over and over, until his breathing steadied and his eyes grew heavy. There is a curious detail in the accounts of his imprisonment. He wrote to a friend that he had learned to sleep in a sitting position, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up to his chest. He said it was because he could not bear to lie flat, for the ceiling seemed to press down on him, and the walls seemed to close in. He felt as though he were being buried alive, and the only way to escape that feeling was to sit up. So he would sit there in the darkness, his head against the cold stone, and he would doze fitfully. He would dream that he was walking in the gardens of his estate, that he could feel the sun on his face, and then the dream would fade, and he would be back in the cell, and the cold would seep into his bones. He would open his eyes and stare at the tiny point of light that came through the window, a star or a lantern. He could never be sure. And he would hold onto that light as if it were the only thing that connected him to the outside world. Eventually, he would fall into a deeper sleep, the kind of sleep that comes from sheer exhaustion, when the body takes over and the mind surrenders. In that sleep, he would dream of nothing, a blank void, and that, he said, was a relief. For a few hours, he would be free from fear and regret. And then he would wake to the sound of the gong scouring, the bell that marked the time, and he would know that another day had begun, a day closer to his death. He would look at the walls, at the carvings left by other prisoners, names and dates and little crosses, and he would wonder if he would leave his own mark. He did, in fact, carve his initials into the wall, a small T and a C, and they can still be seen there today, a quiet testament to his nights in that cell. The sleep of the condemned is a particular kind of sleep, a sleep that is shadowed by the knowledge of an ending. It is a sleep that is both deep and fragile, like the sleep of a child who knows that morning will bring a punishment. There is a story from the reign of Richard III about a prisoner in the Tower who was scheduled for execution at dawn. The night before, he refused to sleep. He said that he wanted to stay awake, to savor every last moment of consciousness. But the guards told him that he must rest, that he needed his strength. He laughed at that, a bitter laugh. Strength for what, he asked, for the blade. But eventually, the body won, and he fell asleep. He slept so deeply that the guards had to shake him awake at sunrise. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, he did not know where he was. He saw the stone walls and the grim faces of the guards, and then he remembered. He closed his eyes again, and he said that he wished he had never woken up. But sleep is a gift, even in the darkest of times. It is a respite, a small mercy. And in the medieval prison, it was often the only mercy that a prisoner could find. The prisoners who managed to sleep, who found a way to rest their bodies and their minds, were the ones who survived, at least in spirit. Those who could not sleep, who lay awake all night staring at the darkness, often succumbed to despair. The body can endure cold and hunger, but the mind cannot endure sleeplessness. There is a famous case from the 14th century, a French knight named Charles of Navarre, who was imprisoned in the Temple in Paris. He was a restless prisoner, always pacing, always scheming. He would not sleep, not because he was afraid, but because he was determined to find a way out. He would spend his nights studying the walls, looking for weak spots, planning his escape. He told the guards that he had no time for sleep, that sleep was a waste of precious hours. But after a few weeks, his body began to fail. He started to hallucinate, seeing doors that were not there, hearing voices that were not real. He would wake from a doze with a start, convinced that he had heard the sound of a key in the lock. And then he would laugh, a crazed laugh, and the guards would look at each other and shake their heads. One night, he collapsed. He simply fell to the floor, unconscious. The guards dragged him to his bed, and he slept for nearly 2 days straight. When he woke, he was calmer. He accepted that escape was unlikely, and he began to sleep more regularly. He said later that the sleep had saved his life, that it had brought him back from the edge of madness. He learned to welcome the darkness, to see it not as an enemy, but as a friend. He would lie on his straw bed, and he would listen to his own breathing, and he would let his thoughts drift. He would think of the fields of his homeland, of the scent of hay and the sound of birds, and he would sleep not as a defeated man, but as a man who had made peace with his fate. There is a lesson in that, a lesson about the resilience of the human heart. The medieval prisoner had very little control over his life. He could not choose his meals, his clothes, or his companions, but he could choose how he slept. He could choose to fight it, or he could choose to surrender to it. And the wise prisoner learned to surrender, to let go of the day's fears and the night's terrors, and to trust in the simple rhythm of breath and rest. It was not easy. It required a kind of courage that is often overlooked, a quiet courage that does not make it into the history books. But it was real, and it was powerful. Think of the woman who was held in the keep of a castle in the Scottish borders, a woman named Margaret. She was accused of witchcraft, though all she had done was to heal a sick horse with a poultice of herbs. She was thrown into a tower that was cold and damp, and she was given only a thin blanket and a pile of straw. She had a small child, a boy of 3 years, who was allowed to stay with her. And each night she would hold her son close, wrapping the blanket around both of them, and she would sing to him. She sang old lullabies, songs her mother had sung to her, songs that spoke of the moon and the stars and the sea. The guards would hear her singing, and they would shake their heads, but they did not stop her. And the boy would fall asleep in her arms, his breath warm against her neck. Then Margaret would close her eyes, and she would let the lullabies play in her mind, and she too would drift off. She said later that those nights were the only thing that kept her sane. The cold and the hunger were nothing compared to the warmth of her son's body, the sound of his breathing. And she slept, not deeply, but peacefully, because she was not alone. That is the final thread in this tapestry of medieval sleep, the thread of connection. Even in the isolation of a dungeon, prisoners found ways to reach out to each other, to share warmth, to share stories, to share the burden of the night. They would whisper through the walls, passing messages and greetings. They would tap on the stone in a secret code, a language that the guards could not understand. And in those whispers and taps, they created a community, a network of sleepless souls who kept each other company. And sometimes, the comfort of knowing that another person was there, just on the other side of the wall, was enough to lull a prisoner into sleep. There is an account from the prison of Newgate in London, from the 15th century, written by a friar named William. He visited the prison often to minister to the souls of the prisoners. He wrote that the night was the hardest time, that the darkness seemed to magnify every fear. But he also noted that the prisoners would sometimes sing together, a hymn or a ballad, and the sound would echo through the halls. And the singing would calm them, and they would fall asleep, one by one, until only the youngest and the most frightened were still awake. And the guards would let them sing, because it meant that the prisoners slept, and a sleeping prisoner was a quiet prisoner. So the night would pass, with its own rituals and rhythms. The rats would scurry, the wind would howl, the guards would change at the hour, and the prisoners would sleep in their various ways, each one finding his own path into the darkness. Some slept with their hands clasped in prayer, some with their arms wrapped around themselves, some with their faces turned to the wall. They dreamed of home, of food, of freedom. And when morning came, they would wake, and the cycle would begin again. And now, as you lie in your own bed, in the quiet of your own room, you too can close your eyes and let the gentle darkness take you. You can think of these prisoners, of their cold stone floors and their thin straw beds, and you can feel a small gratitude for the warmth of your blanket, the softness of your pillow. You can remember that sleep is a gift, a small mercy that has been given to humans since the beginning of time. And you can let go of your own worries, your own fears, and trust that the night will hold you. The medieval prisoner knew that trust, or learned it, and so can you. So breathe deeply and let the sound of your own breath be the only sound you hear. Let the weight of the day slip away, and let the quiet darkness wrap around you like a blanket worn thin but still warm. And sleep. Sleep as the prisoners slept, not in despair, but in surrender. Sleep as they slept, with the knowledge that the night will pass and the morning will come. Sleep as they slept, into the gentle, forgiving arms of sleep. And yet, before we fully surrender to the night, let us recall one more story from the shadows of the medieval tower. It is a story of a man who found sleep in the most unlikely of places. A man who discovered that even in the deepest darkness, there is a light that cannot be extinguished. His name was John, a simple farmer from the county of Kent, who had been imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. He was thrown into the dungeon of a castle, a place so deep and so dark that the sun never touched it. The floor was damp, the walls were slick with moisture, and the air was thick and cold. He had no straw, no blanket, nothing but the clothes on his back. The guards gave him a piece of bread and a cup of water once a day, and they left him alone. The first night, John could not sleep. He was too cold, too scared, too angry. He sat with his back against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest, and he stared into the darkness. He thought of his wife and his children, of the warm fire in his cottage, of the smell of baking bread. He thought of the injustice that had brought him here, and he felt a rage that burned like a coal in his chest. He swore that he would not sleep, that he would stay awake and plan his escape. But the night was long, and the cold seeped into his bones, and his eyes grew heavy. He dozed off, but he woke with a start, his heart pounding. He had dreamed that he was falling into a bottomless pit. He shook his head and pressed his palms against his temples. He could not sleep. He would not sleep. But the second night was different. The hunger had weakened him, and the cold had numbed his limbs. He no longer had the strength to fight. He lay down on the stone floor, curling into a tight ball, and he closed his eyes. He did not expect to sleep. He simply lay there, waiting for the hours to pass. But then something strange happened. He began to hear a sound, a soft pattering sound, like raindrops on a roof. He opened his eyes, but he saw only darkness. He listened, and the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of water dripping from the ceiling onto the floor. Drip, drip, drip. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, a sound that had no beginning and no end. And John, without knowing why, began to breathe in time with the dripping. In, out, and His muscles relaxed, and his thoughts slowed, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest. He was still cold, still hungry, still a prisoner. But the sound of the dripping water was like a lullaby, a gentle reminder that the world was still turning, that time was still passing. And he slept. He slept more deeply than he had ever slept in his life, more deeply than he had slept in his own bed, with his wife beside him. He did not dream. He simply fell into a black, silent void, and he rested. When he woke, the guards were there, shaking him, telling him that his trial was to be held that day. He stood up, and he felt stronger. The sleep had restored him, not completely, but enough. He walked to the courtroom, and he faced the judge, and he told his story. The judge, moved by his honesty and his poverty, gave him a light sentence. John was released after 3 more days. He went home, and he held his wife and his children, and he told them about the sound of the dripping water, how it had saved him. He said that whenever he felt afraid, he would close his eyes and listen for that drip, 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 and he would feel calm again. He had found a kind of peace in the most unlikely of places, in the dungeon of a castle, in the sound of water on stone. That is the power of sleep, the power to transform even the darkest of nights into a quiet haven. The medieval prisoners could not change their circumstances, but they could change how they met the night. They could choose to listen to the sounds around them, to let those sounds become a rhythm that carried them into rest. They could choose to focus on the small comforts, the warmth of a shared blanket, the softness of a well-worn prayer, the familiar melody of a lullaby. And in doing so, they became masters of their own sleep, even when they were slaves to their captivity. Think now of the many towers and dungeons across the medieval world, each one holding its own silent story. In the Tower of London, prisoners like Sir Thomas More spent their last nights in a cell that had a small window high up, where a sliver of moonlight would creep in. He would lie on his straw bed, and he would watch that sliver of light move slowly across the wall. He said that it was like a companion, a visitor from the world outside, and he would fall asleep with his eyes on that light, as if it were a candle burning just for him. He slept well, they say, even on the night before his execution. He slept not because he was unafraid, but because he had made peace with his fate. He had surrendered, not in despair, but in trust. And in the dungeons of the German castles, prisoners would sometimes create a small game to pass the night. They would tie a bit of string or a strip of cloth to a pebble, and they would swing it back and forth in the darkness, like a pendulum. They would watch it move, or rather, they would feel it move, because they could not see. And the gentle swinging would lull them into a trance, a kind of waking sleep. They would count the swings 1, 2, 3, until they lost count, and then they would feel their eyelids grow heavy, and they would let go of the string and drift away. It was a small ritual, a tiny act of control, but it was enough. So as you lie here now in your own bed, you too can create a ritual. You can listen to the sounds of the night, the hum of the furnace, the tick of a clock, the soft breath of someone sleeping nearby. You can let those sounds become a lullaby. You can feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, and you can know that you are safe. The medieval prisoners had none of these comforts, yet they found a way to sleep. They found a way to let go. And if they could do it in the cold and the dark and the fear, then surely you can do it now, in the warmth and the quiet and the peace. So close your eyes. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow river. Think of John and his dripping water. Think of Margaret and her lullabies. Think of all the nameless prisoners who slept in the stone cells, who dreamed of home and freedom and love. And then let them go. Let the stories fade into the night, like embers turning to ash. And sleep. Sleep as they slept, not in despair, but in surrender. Sleep as they slept, with the knowledge that the night will hold you, that the morning will come, and that you are not alone. Sleep, and let the gentle darkness wrap around you, like a blanket worn thin but still warm. Sleep, into the gentle, forgiving arms of sleep. And yet, even as you feel yourself sinking deeper into the softness of your pillow, let us linger just a moment longer within the stone walls of the past. For every prisoner who found sleep through sound or ritual, there were others who discovered a different kind of solace, the quiet company of the stones themselves. In the dungeons of the French castle of Chinon, a nobleman named Etienne was held for years in a circular cell carved directly into the bedrock. The walls were not rough like those of a hastily built tower, but smooth, worn by centuries of water seeping through the limestone. He would press his palm against the cool surface and feel the faint tremor of the earth beneath the castle, the distant pulse of a world that still turned. That touch became his anchor. He would trace the lines in the stone, the veins of mineral that ran like rivers under his fingertips, and he would imagine that he was tracing the path of a stream near his childhood home. The stone did not judge him, did not threaten him. It simply held him patient and silent. And in that silence, he found the most profound rest he had ever known. He learned to sleep not in spite of the cold hardness around him, but because of it. The stone became his companion, his confidant, his bed. He would curl against it, cheek to rock, and breathe in the musty scent of ages. And the stone would absorb his fear, his anger, his grief, leaving only a deep, still quietude. Think now of the many prisoners who slept with their ears pressed to the ground, listening for the footsteps of guards or the distant rumble of a portcullis. They learned to distinguish the sounds of the castle as a musician learns the notes of a song. The creak of a door, the clank of a bucket, the murmur of voices in the courtyard, each sound became a marker of time, a lullaby that told them the world was still in motion. And when the sounds grew faint, when the castle settled into the deep silence of the night, they knew it was safe to let go. They surrendered not to despair, but to the rhythm of the hours. So as you lie here now, your own breath slowing, your thoughts dissolving like mist, remember that you share this night with all those who came before. The stone walls that held them are the same stone that holds the earth beneath your home. The darkness that surrounded them is the same darkness that now presses gently against your eyelids. And the sleep that found them in their cold and lonely cells is the same sleep that now wraps itself around you, tender and patient. Let go of the stories now. Let go of John and his dripping water, of Etienne and his stone companion. They have found their rest, and you will find yours. Close your eyes. Breathe in slow and deep. And as you exhale, release the weight of the day, the weight of the centuries, the weight of all that keeps you from the quiet. Sleep deep and still. Sleep as they slept. Into the gentle, forgiving arms of sleep. Good night.